The dry Texas wind carried the scent of sand and bitter sagebrush, whipping against Sarah's pale face. She stood there, her hands gripping the worn wooden handle of a shovel. Beneath her feet lay a freshly dug grave, the earth not yet packed down, no priest, no choir, and absolutely no one from the town of Oakhaven had come to Arthur Miller's funeral. There was only the eerie silence of the wasteland, occasionally torn by the caw of a distant crow. Sarah didn't cry. Her tears seemed to have evaporated during the countless sleepless nights spent nursing her consumptive father. She drove the blade of the shovel into the dirt and was about to turn toward the dilapidated wooden farmhouse when the crunch of horseshoes on gravel shattered the silence. 4 men on horseback rode into the yard. Leading them was Silas Vance, plump and clad in an expensive silk vest that starkly contrasted with the poverty of the land. Silas was the only banker in Oakhaven, and the vulture who fed on the corpses of bankrupt ranches. A sad day. "Miss Sarah," Silas spoke, his voice slick as grease, not bothering to tip his felt hat. He signaled his 3 henchmen to fan out, a clear move of intimidation. "What are you doing here, Silas?" Sarah replied coldly, her hand instinctively backing toward the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch. "My father hasn't been in the ground for an hour," Silas clicked his tongue in mock sympathy. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a stack of yellowed parchment tied with a piece of twine. Arthur was a good man, but a terrible gambler, and an even worse farmer. Silas tossed the stack onto a wooden barrel in front of Sarah. "He mortgaged this entire ranch, the cattle, and the very dirt under your feet 3 years ago to buy seeds and settle poker debts. The deadline was yesterday." Sarah's heart seized. She stepped forward, quickly flipping through the pages. Her father's signature sat right there, sloppy and desperate. The number at the bottom made her dizzy. $4,000. Even in the most bountiful harvest years, the Miller Ranch had never earned a third of that amount. "This is a scam," she hissed, looking up at Silas with fiery emerald eyes. "You swindled him when he was drunk. The law doesn't care if a man is drunk or sober when he signs his name." "Little girl," Silas smirked, his eyes beginning to slide down Sarah's body, lingering on her narrow waist and a face that, despite the dirt, radiated fierce beauty. He dismounted, stepping closer, blowing the smell of a cheap cigar into her face. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. 4,000 is a lot of money, but a beautiful, helpless young woman like yourself shouldn't have to suffer. Move into my mansion in town, be my woman, and Arthur Miller's debt goes up in smoke." Sarah felt her stomach churn in disgust. She took a step back and spat right onto the toe of Silas's polished leather boot. "I'd rather let the coyotes chew my bones on this land than set foot in your house." Silas's face darkened. He pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his boot, his voice dropping its fake charm. "Pride won't fill your belly, you bitch. 3 days. I'll give you 3 days to scrape together $4,000, or I'll have my men throw your trash in the dirt and sell you to a brothel across the border to collect what's mine." Silas mounted his horse and rode off, leaving behind a choking cloud of dust. That night, a gale howled around the wooden house by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Sarah emptied everything she owned onto the table, a few stray silver coins, her father's broken pocket watch, and her late mother's wedding ring. Less than $20. She buried her face in her hands. For the first time since her father's death, her shoulders shook. There was no one to borrow from. Silas owned this town. Run away? This place was her mother's only legacy, her own flesh and blood, but staying meant facing death, or something far worse. 3 days. The pendulum clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, counting down her final moments of survival on this earth, on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The Oakhaven sky was a leaden gray. Sarah, wearing her only black mourning dress, sat ramrod straight in an armchair in the parlor. A fully loaded Winchester rifle rested across her lap. She had no money, but she had bullets. If Silas wanted this ranch, he would have to step over her dead body. A horse whinnied in the yard. Heavy boots stomped onto the wooden porch. The front door was kicked open without mercy. Silas walked in with 4 armed henchmen. He looked at Sarah and sneered. "Time's up. Judging by your attitude, I'm guessing you didn't dig up $4,000 from under your floorboards? Sarah slowly raised the barrel of the rifle, aiming straight at Silas's chest. Get out of my house. Shoot me, and my boys will blow your brains out before you can rack the lever, Silas growled, signaling his men to spread out. Grab the little bitch. At that moment of absolute tension, just as Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, a massive shadow blocked the light from the doorway. The cold clink of spurs against the floorboards rang out. Clink, clink, clink. Everyone froze. A man stepped over the threshold. He was tall, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the entire doorway. A black Stetson was pulled low, obscuring the upper half of his face, revealing only a long, jagged scar running from his cheekbone down to his jaw, a deep slash that looked like it had nearly taken his life. He wore a dust-covered leather duster, and at his hips hung two ivory-handled revolvers, holstered in a way that said he could draw and fire in the blink of an eye. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. The man radiated an aura of oppressive lethality, causing even Silas's hardened thugs to instinctively take a step back. "Who the hell are you?" Silas stammered, trying to maintain his authority. "This is private business of Mr. Silas Vance. Get out." The stranger didn't answer. He leisurely pulled off his leather gloves and walked to the wooden table in the center of the room. From inside his coat, he pulled out a heavy burlap sack and slammed it down. Clang! The bag fell open. Solid gold bars and gleaming gold eagle coins spilled across the scratched wood. $4,000, plus $500 for your sheer stupidity. The man's voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like two flintstones grinding together. He looked up, his ash-gray eyes pinning Silas in place. "Arthur Miller's debt is paid in full. This land is under my protection. Now get out, before I use your tongue to shine my boots." Silas's jaw dropped as he stared at the gold. He looked at the stranger, then at the guns on his hips. One of the thugs leaned in and whispered frantically into Silas's ear, "Boss, the ivory handles. That scar. That's Jack the Hunter, the one who wiped out the Dalton gang last month." Silas went pale, without another word. He snatched up the gold, tossed the deed onto the table, and scrambled out the door with his men, fleeing like rats from a burning barn. The room returned to its original silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the window cracks. Sarah slowly lowered her rifle, her hands trembling. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had just been saved. But how? And why? Why would a notorious bounty hunter drop a fortune to save a rundown ranch belonging to a stranger? Who are you?" Sarah managed to ask, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have nothing to repay you for that gold." Jack turned to look at her. For the first time, Sarah clearly saw his eyes. There was no lust like Silas's, nor any pity. They were bottomless, quiet, and terrifyingly cold. He stepped forward, picked up her father's debt contract, tore it in half, and let the pieces flutter to the floor. "I don't want your money," Jack said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "I bought this land, and I bought you." Sarah froze, her stomach knotting again. The budding sense of gratitude was instantly suffocated by humiliation. "So that's it," she thought bitterly. "Just trading one bastard for a richer one. I'm not a piece of property." She lifted her chin, her defiant gaze meeting his overwhelming presence. "If you want my body to settle the debt, you might as well kill me right here." A strange flicker, so fast and fragile it almost felt like an illusion, flashed in Jack's eyes before vanishing. He tipped his hat down and said indifferently, "I have no interest in your body. I need someone to manage this ranch when I'm gone, a legal cover, and you need a place to live, an umbrella so rats like Silas won't ever dare to come near you again." He walked toward the door, stopping to drop one last cold command. "Tomorrow morning, put on your most decent dress. We're going to the sheriff's office to get a marriage license. Marry me, and this ranch remains your home. If not, pack your bags and be gone by dawn. The choice is yours." The door slammed shut. The next morning, the sky was still gray. At the Oak Haven Sheriff's Office, a brief swearing-in ceremony took place in under 5 minutes. No flowers, no rings, no kiss. The bewildered sheriff stamped the certificate with red ink, stealing nervous glances at the terrifying bounty hunter standing rigidly beside the pale young woman before signing her name. Sarah looked at Jack, her voice loud and clear enough for the whole room to hear. "I am marrying you for this contract. I will cook, I will clean, I will tend to your horses. But this dirt belongs to the Millers, and you, sir, are never to step foot inside my bedroom." Jack took the pen and signed his name with a sharp, decisive stroke. He didn't look at her, answering only in a dry rasp, "Lock your door tight. Ma'am, I sleep in the barn." The contract was signed. A marriage of convenience had begun. Little did Sarah know that the moment she signed her name next to the scarred man's, she had tied herself to a secret buried for 15 years. The first 3 weeks of their marriage passed in near absolute silence, true to his word. Jack never crossed the threshold of the main house after dinner. Despite the bone-chilling cold of the plains at night, he would grab a rough wool blanket, cross the wind-swept yard, and shut himself in the barn. Every morning. When Sarah woke up and stepped into the kitchen, the hearth was already glowing. The ashes were neatly swept. On the table sat a bucket of freshly drawn well water, freezing cold but crystal clear. And outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting firewood echoed like a metronome. They worked together, yet drifted around each other like two ghosts haunting the same land. He patched the leaking roof, shoveled horse manure, and single-handedly reinforced the western fence line. It was that fence that first made Sarah pause. It was a broken section where coyotes had once sneaked in to kill the sheep, when her father was alive. He had always nailed the wooden planks vertically as a quick fix, making the fence weak. As a child, Sarah used to complain to him, "Why don't you cross the boards in an X shape? It would be as solid as a wall." Her father had only laughed it off. That afternoon, while carrying a basket of bread into the yard, she dropped it in sheer shock. Jack was shirtless under the pale sun, sweat soaking into a brutal tapestry of scars crisscrossing his back. In his hand was a sledgehammer, and the broken fence had been perfectly X-braced with thick planks, so sturdy that a charging bull couldn't knock it down. How did he know that specific design? Was it just a coincidence? The second strange occurrence happened a few days later. During a trip to town for supplies, where Jack's mere presence caused crowds to part in silent terror, he brought back a paper bag. He roughly tossed it onto the kitchen table without a word, then turned on his heel to whittle wood on the porch. Sarah opened the bag. It wasn't the bitter, dark roasted coffee beans that Western cowboys drank like water. It was a tin of dried chamomile flowers. She stared at the tea tin, her trembling fingers tracing the cold metal rim. She hated coffee. The stuff made her nauseous. Her mother used to brew chamomile tea for her on sleepless nights, but her mother had been dead for years, and her father had never once remembered to buy it. How did a bounty hunter who had walked into her life 3 weeks ago know this? That evening, as she cleared the last dinner plate, Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. "Chamomile tea," she spoke up, cutting through the heavy silence. Her eyes drilled into Jack's broad back as he washed his hands at the basin. "How did you know?" Jack's scrubbing hands paused for half a beat. It was so slight, you'd miss it if you weren't looking. He grabbed a towel and dried his hands without turning around. "The clerk at the general store said women like that dried weed," he replied, his voice gruff and dry. "If you don't like it, feed it to the horses tomorrow." With that, he tipped his hat down over his eyes, gave her a curt nod, and walked out into the silent night. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen. Steam rose from the pot of chamomile, carrying a scent so familiar it made her heart ache for the first time. She looked through the small window, her eyes fixed on the flickering oil lamp glowing through the cracks of the barn. Her initial caution was slowly giving way to a burning question beneath that brutal, blood-soaked exterior. Who are you really? Jack? November hit Oak Haven with the fury of nature. A blizzard swept through the valley without warning, burying everything in white within hours. The wind howled like a starving wolf, whipping shards of ice against the cabin walls. Sitting inside by the hearth, Sarah wrung her hands anxiously. 3 hours had passed. Jack had gone out to herd the young horses into the barn before the storm broke, but he hadn't returned. The temperature outside could freeze a man's blood in 20 minutes. She threw on her thickest sheepskin coat, lit a hurricane lantern, and shoved the front door open. The gale nearly knocked her off her feet. "Jack!" she screamed, but the wind swallowed her voice instantly. The snow was past her knees. Sarah trudged toward the barn when she finally managed to heave the heavy wooden doors open. A sight that made her heart drop materialized in the dim light. The horses were safely stalled, but Jack was collapsed on the straw-covered floor near the frozen water trough. His leather duster was stiff with ice, and a broken roof beam lay across his leg. He had used the last of his strength to push the wood off, but the cold had drained the life out of the hunter. "Dear God, Jack!" Sarah dropped the lantern and rushed to his side. His lips were blue. His shallow breaths formed faint wisps of vapor. She hooked her arms under his armpits and, using every ounce of strength a farm girl possessed, dragged the massive man up. By some miracle she would never be able to explain. She hauled him across the raging yard, kicked the cabin door open, and let him drop onto the bearskin rug in front of the fire. Jack was shaking violently. Hypothermia had set in. "You are not allowed to die. You hear me? You bastard! I will not let you die in my house." Sarah gritted her teeth, her freezing fingers frantically tearing off his soaking, ice-caked clothes. She stripped off his duster, his gun belt, and ripped open his wet shirt as the last layer of clothing was pulled away. Sarah froze, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp of horror. His back and chest did not have a single inch of untouched skin. Scars crisscrossed over each other like a cruel, twisted web. There were deep gouges from bullwhips that had faded with time. There were perfectly round burn marks from branding irons, and the long scar on his face. It was merely a scratch compared to the hell this body had endured. What kind of inferno had he lived through? Sarah swallowed her tears. She piled every blanket in the house on top of him and piled more wood into the hearth. But Jack was still convulsing. His skin was cold as a corpse. There was no time left to think about boundaries or propriety, remembering what the town doctor once said about saving a man from freezing to death. Sarah stripped off her outer layers until she was down to a thin nightgown and crawled under the pile of blankets. She wrapped her arms around him. She pressed her warm skin against the scarred, freezing back of the strange man. She draped a leg over him and held him tight in her embrace, transferring every ounce of her body heat into him. "Sarah." The faint whisper broke through the night. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He had just called her by her name, not ma'am, not you, just Sarah in his delirium. Jack's large, rough hand blindly searched for hers. He intertwined his fingers with hers, holding on with the desperate grip of a drowning man clinging to a lifeboat. "Don't cry, Nightingale. I won't let them hurt you," he mumbled, his feverish breath grazing her shoulder. A single tear slipped from Sarah's eye and soaked into the wool blanket. Nightingale, that was the pet name her father used to call her when she was little, because she always hummed a tune while milking the cows. Aside from her father, no living soul knew that name. That night, in the dead center of the worst blizzard of the decade, wrapped in the arms of a blood-stained killer, Sarah felt absolutely safe for the first time since her father's death. All her fears evaporated, replaced by a fierce ache and a pounding in her chest that she could no longer deny. 3 days later, the storm broke. The sun pierced over the white snow, bringing the bitter but crystal-clear cold of Texas. Jack had survived the worst of it, unlike his vulnerable state during the blizzard. The moment he woke up, he immediately threw up an impenetrable fortress of defense. He avoided her eyes, rejected her attempts to nurse him, and despite a severe limp from the fallen beam, stubbornly moved back out to the barn. The tension between them multiplied tenfold, because both knew the boundaries had been shattered that night, yet neither dared to speak a word of it. That morning, Jack rode out toward the tree line to hunt a buck for winter meat. Sarah stayed behind to tidy the cabin. She brought his wet leather coat and saddlebags to dry by the hearth. The worn leather bag was heavy when she lifted it. The waterlogged leather strap snapped. Thud. Clatter. A few personal items spilled onto the floorboards, a brass matchbox, spare cartridges, and a small, battered tin used for chewing tobacco. The tin popped open. Sarah bent down to pick it up. Her breathing suddenly froze. Rolling across the wood was a heavily scratched silver dollar, pierced with a small hole near the edge and strung on a leather cord. Next to it lay a wooden nightingale, whittled from oak, rough in its making but carved with painstaking detail down to every feather. It felt as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to Sarah's chest. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, her trembling fingers picking up the coin, the hole on the edge. The V-shaped scratch across Lady Liberty's face, there was no mistaking it. A memory from 15 years ago, a fragment buried under the dust of time since she was 8 years old, suddenly burst open like a broken dam. It was a year of severe drought. A caravan of drifters and white slave traders was passing through Oakhaven. That afternoon, 8-year-old Sarah sneaked a basket of bread into town. She saw a boy, maybe 13, starved and wearing rags, chained to a wagon wheel under the scorching sun. His back was bleeding from fresh whip marks. The slavers had left him there to die of thirst. The townspeople ignored him. Kids threw rocks at him. But little Sarah, defying her father's strict orders, tiptoed closer. She brought the boy a tin cup of cool well water and half a loaf of bread before her father dragged her away. She pressed something into the boy's bloody palm, a pierced silver dollar, her lucky coin. "Take this. Don't die," she had whispered. The boy had looked up at her. His eyes were ash-gray, quiet, and bottomless. Sarah clutched the coin and the wooden bird to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, those ash-gray eyes, the exact look Jack gave Silas the day he threw the gold on the table, the web of whip scars on his back, the X-braced fence she had casually mentioned in front of a chained boy, the chamomile tea, the nightingale. Everything pieced together with devastating perfection. He wasn't some random bounty hunter looking for a place to crash. He didn't buy the debt to claim her body or her ranch for 15 years. The boy chained to the wagon wheel had walked through a hell of blood and fire, selling his life to do the dirtiest jobs, hoarding every single gold coin, just for the chance to come back here. He bought the debt, staged a cruel marriage of convenience, and played the terrifying villain, all to protect her from a collapsing world without wounding her pride. "You idiot," Sarah sobbed, her shoulders shaking violently. "You cruel, beautiful idiot." She looked out the window, where the snow-covered trail led toward the woods, her fear, her caution, and every defensive wall she had built shattered into dust. Now, there was only a fierce, burning love and a desperate need to heal the man who carried far too many wounds. But in the Wild West, happiness rarely comes without a blood price, just as Sarah wiped her tears, preparing to step outside and wait for Jack. The thunderous sound of hooves and cold, sharp whistling echoed from the ranch gates. Silas hadn't given up. He was back. And this time, he had brought no less than a dozen of the most ruthless hired guns in the territory. The crunch of hooves on frozen snow signaled the arrival of death. Sarah quickly shoved the silver coin and the wooden bird into her apron pocket. She grabbed the Winchester from the corner, racked the lever with a sharp clack, and overturned the heavy oak dining table to act as a barricade beneath the window. Peeking through the gap, she counted 12 mounted men, heavily armed, rifles in hand. Leading the pack was Silas Vance in a sheepskin coat, a sinister smirk revealing his yellowed teeth. "Jack the Hunter," Silas's voice boomed, arrogant and echoing in the cold wind. "I know you're gone. Come on out, you Miller bitch, pay up, or I'll burn this cabin to the ground with you inside it." Sarah didn't answer. Her heart pounded, but her grip on the rifle was rock steady. She was a daughter of the West. If she had to die, she was dragging a few of these bastards to hell with her. "Burn it," Silas ordered coldly when met with silence. 2 thugs lit torches, preparing to hurl them onto the dry wooden porch. Bang! Sarah's Winchester spat fire. The bullet shattered the window glass and tore through the torchbearer's shoulder. He screamed, dropping into the snow. The torch fizzled out. "Kill her!" Silas roared. A dozen muzzles flashed at once. The cabin shuddered under a hail of lead. Glass exploded. Wood splinters flew through the air, grazing Sarah's face. She huddled behind the thick tabletop, holding her breath as she reloaded, returning fire shot for shot at the dark figures closing in. But she was only one woman, and there were too many of them. A hulking outlaw managed to flank the house and kicked the side door off its hinges. He leveled a 6-shooter right at her head. "Hello, darlin'," he grinned. Crack. The man's head snapped back, blood spraying across the wooden wall. He crumpled to the floor as Sarah stared in shock. From the snowy tree line, a deafening roar echoed. It was the sharp, devastating crack of a repeating rifle. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, her heart soaring. He stood atop the highest ridge, looking like an angel of vengeance stepping out of the blizzard. His long coat billowed in the wind. In 3 seconds, he pumped the lever and fired 3 shots. 3 of Silas's men dropped dead with fatal wounds to the chest. Silas's posse panicked. "Shoot him! Blow his goddamn head off!" the banker shrieked, firing wildly at the ridge. Jack dropped the empty rifle, drew his twin ivory-handled revolvers, and charged straight down the snowy slope. He moved with the terrifying speed and deadly silence of an apex predator. He didn't seek cover. He walked straight into the enemy's crossfire. Bang, bang, bang. With every step Jack took, a body hit the snow. The sheer aura of the man who single-handedly slaughtered the Dalton gang struck pure terror into the hired guns. A few immediately turned their horses and fled for their lives. Silas, realizing he was losing the fight, dove behind a dented wheelbarrow in the yard. Through the broken window, he caught sight of Sarah moving inside the cabin. A vicious light flared in his eyes. "If I'm going down, I'm taking your woman with me." Silas leveled his rifle, taking careful aim at Sarah as she stood up. His finger squeezed the trigger. "Sarah!" Jack roared, a sound that tore violently from his throat. He threw his entire body across the window frame the exact moment the bullet tore through the air. Thwack! A sickening thud echoed as the bullet tore into Jack's right side. He staggered and crashed backward onto the floorboards, bright red blood instantly soaking his white shirt. But his ash-gray eyes didn't blink once. The second his back hit the floor, he raised his revolver, aiming flawlessly through the shattered window. Bang! The bullet caught Silas dead between the eyes. The corrupt banker's eyes bulged before he slowly collapsed into the snow, never to threaten anyone again. The gunfight was over. A terrifying silence descended upon the ranch, filled only by the moaning wind and the acrid stench of gunpowder. "Jack, no, no, no." Sarah dropped her rifle and crawled to him, pressing both hands hard against the gushing wound on his side. Tears streamed down onto the hunter's pale cheeks. Jack gasped for air, his blood and mud-stained hand trembling as he reached up to gently stop her. Are you hurt?" he rasped, his eyes frantically scanning her body for injuries. "I'm fine, you idiot! I'm fine! Save your strength! I'll get the bandages!" Sarah sobbed, her vision blurring with tears. The corner of Jack's mouth twitched upward into a rare smile, a real one. Not his usual cold smirk. His rough thumb gently wiped away a stray lock of hair from her forehead, leaving a streak of blood. Then his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into darkness. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of the hearth. The smell of gunpowder had been replaced by the scent of boiling water and medicinal herbs. When Jack painfully blinked his eyes open, the throbbing agony in his side reminded him he was still alive. The bullet had passed clean through the muscle, missing his vitals. He was lying on a soft mattress in Sarah's bedroom, the room he had sworn never to enter. He turned his head. Sarah was asleep by the edge of the bed, her small hand tightly gripping 3 of his calloused fingers. In the flickering firelight, he saw something resting on the bedside table, his opened tobacco tin. Beside it lay the pierced silver dollar and the wooden nightingale. Every defensive wall Jack had ever built crumbled into dust. He knew he couldn't hide anymore. He gently tried to pull his hand away, but the slight movement woke Sarah. She lifted her head, her eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, but shining brilliantly when she saw him awake. "You are out of your mind." Sarah spoke first, her voice raspy but fierce. She placed her hand over the wooden bird. 15 years, you traded your life for gold, bought my father's debt, let me curse you as a cruel tyrant, all for a cup of well water." "Jack?" Jack closed his eyes. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with immense effort. "You don't understand." "Sarah." His voice was gravelly, carrying the exhaustion of a lifetime. "That day, you didn't just give me water. You showed a chained wild animal that he was still a human being. My entire youth was blood, mud, and killing. I've put countless men in the ground. My hands are filthy. I have no right to stand under the same roof as you." He grimaced in pain, reached under his pillow, and weakly pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. He pressed it into her hand. This is the deed to the ranch. I had it transferred to your name before the blizzard hit. Tomorrow, when I can sit a horse. I'll ride out. The marriage contract is null and void. Silas is dead. You are safe, and you are free." Sarah looked at the paper in her hand. His signature sat at the bottom, neat and decisive, just like the way he fired a gun. She looked at him. The deadliest killer in the West was refusing to meet her eyes, shrinking back into his deepest insecurities and guilt. He thought he was a monster. He was terrified of tarnishing her light without a word. Sarah stood up. She took the deed, the piece of paper men had bled and died for, and ripped it in half. The sound tore sharply through the quiet room. Then she tore it into quarters, then eighths, and tossed the scraps straight into the fireplace. The flames devoured them in an instant. Jack stared at her in sheer shock. "What the hell are you?" His words were cut off. Sarah leaned down and crashed her soft lips against his. It was a clumsy kiss, tasting of salt, medicine, and months of suppressed longing. Jack went rigid. He was like a stone statue struck by lightning. But when she threaded her fingers into his messy hair, her warmth seeping through his bandages, the man's primal instinct took over. He reached up with his uninjured arm, wrapping it tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and returned the kiss with a desperate, hungry ferocity when they finally broke apart to breathe. Sarah rested her forehead against his. Her emerald eyes stared straight into the dark abyss of his ash-gray ones. "You paid off my father's debt," she whispered, her voice soft but holding the unshakable strength of the Oakhaven cliffs. "Now, it's my turn to pay off my own life. I am your wife. Jack, from now until death parts us, don't you ever dare step foot off this ranch again." Tears welled up in the eyes of the hardest bounty hunter in the territory. He buried his face into the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of chamomile, the scent of life, of family. His arms locked around her, as if afraid this beautiful illusion would vanish if he let go. But he knew this was no illusion. Finally, after 15 years of wandering through hell, the wild beast had found his way home. 1 year later, spring arrived in the Oakhaven Valley, bringing a carpet of wild yellow chamomile that stretched from the wooden fences all the way to the tree line. The charred ruins of last year's shootout were completely gone. In their place stood a brand new, solid oak farmhouse with an expanded porch and a small wooden swing. Horses grazed lazily in the corral. Needless to say, no rogue cowboys or debt collectors ever dared wander near this land. The name of the ranch's owner alone was enough to strike the fear of God into anyone with bad intentions. In the warm morning sun, Jack wore a white linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. He was carefully sanding a cradle made of pine. Hands that had once been stained with the blood of outlaws now moved with absolute tenderness and precision. He had been carving this cradle for 2 weeks. The front door creaked open. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, one hand supporting her round, 7-month pregnant belly, the other carrying a tray with a steaming teapot. She set the tray on the table, walked up behind Jack, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "The doctor told you not to carry heavy things," Jack grumbled, but his large hand immediately reached back to caress hers with practiced ease. He leaned his head back to kiss her cheek. "It's just a pot of chamomile tea," Sarah beamed, resting her head on his shoulder and admiring the nearly finished little crib. On the headboard, Jack had meticulously carved a nightingale spreading its wings. There was no more distance, no more darkness, and absolutely no one sleeping in the barn anymore. Jack pulled her down onto his lap, pressing his ear against her belly to listen to the tiny life kicking energetically inside, under the bright sun of the Wild West. His smile was as radiant and peaceful as a river after a storm. The marriage that began with a cruel, blood-soaked debt had finally blossomed into an eternal love.